some kind of connection, and primarily there really hasn't been a program on Bo and C.B. Kearfott that I know of, for decades maybe, telling the story. So Dr. Bill Wade is here. We're privileged to have him. Come on in. Privileged to have him. You probably know his story. He's a retired professor at King College. He's also the vice president of the Bristol Historical Association. So we, on behalf of the Historical Association, welcome you here. And just as far as housekeeping, if you have seats next to you, if you can pull in, this is like church on Easter Sunday, okay? And just breathe in a little bit and scoot over to the seat next to you. We want everybody to be comfortable and enjoy the program tonight. So without any further ado, I'd like to introduce Dr. Bill Wade. And there's a lot that can be said about him that I have not said. I've said very little. But Bill, if you want to make any other comments, but I know the topic tonight is the perfect family. Thank you.
First of all, I want to thank all of you for coming here this evening. Your presence is in itself a recognition of the importance to Bristol of the two Clarence B. Kearfatts, and delighted to have you here. I also want to thank the members of the Kearfott family here, and I want to thank them for having been so generous in providing the information I needed to put together this little slideshow. They brought out everything they had. They took pictures. They told me stories about the family. They gave me various details that I had not known before. And without their help and assistance, there would have been no program tonight. They've done it. I'm very grateful to them. But this is a work in progress. It is not complete. There's a lot that we do not know. The senior Mr. Kearfott came to Bristol in 1907 and opened his architectural office here. And he was active until about World War II. Afterward, his son, Clarence B. Kearfott Jr., took over the practice, and he remained with it until the late 1980s. When the senior Mr. Kearfott came, he started with a job book, which was a loose-leaf booklet, and he listed all of the architectural tasks and commissions that he had, running into the hundreds and hundreds through the 80 years that he and his son were active. We estimate that probably they had about 2,000 assignments during this 80-year period, and you can figure out what that would be, about how many every month or so. It's a good number. And what we're going to do tonight is to look mostly at the work in Bristol. They were active in the larger area around here. They did a lot of work in Abingdon, Marion, Chilhowie, up in Southwest Virginia, Norton. They built schools, they built churches, they built hotels. But we're going to focus upon Bristol because this is what you are. You are a Bristol audience, and that will be our specialty. But we cannot be complete. Unfortunately, in some of the references he made in the Jobs book, he simply referred to building a house for Mr. John Doe. Well, today, 80 years later, or a century later, we don't know who those John Does were. Can't locate them. In some cases, we know the residence, the address. Other cases, we don't even have the address. And so there is one thing I would like to ask you to do. I have here a clipboard, and on this clipboard are some little forms to fill out. And if you live in a Kearfott designed house, we may not know that yet. I'm going to put it over here on the table, and I would appreciate it after the program if you would come by and sign your name, the address, the approximate date of your Kearfott house when it was built, and if you happen to know the name of the original owner, we would appreciate that. With that kind of information, we can go to the Jobs book and begin to identify specifically which these houses are. I'm going to place it over here. It will be right here for you, and that you can be a part of our program. It's a substantial part of our program. All right. call this program an architectural legacy for Bristol. And we say that on purpose. A legacy is a term that is often used in a legal sense. It means a gift that has been made by someone at a previous time for the use and benefit of persons who will come along later. And that's exactly what the Kearfotts did. They made a gift of their architectural ability. And there are many buildings that they built here for Bristol, and we are now the beneficiaries of that. We're enjoying the Kearfott legacy. And this program will consider both of them. As you can see from the slide, there were two of them, Clarence Baker Kearfott, 1884 to 1978, and his son, Clarence Baker Kearfott, 1917 to 1989. They were active together for a period of about 80 years, from 1907 until the retirement of the younger Mr. Kearfott in the late 1980s. Now, they did not go by the terms senior and junior. Instead, they were known by nicknames. The senior Mr. Kearfott was Blue John. And if you wonder where that came from, wait and see. We'll say something about it in a minute. The younger Mr. Kearfott was always known from childhood as Bo. And so we're going to refer to them tonight as Blue John and Bo. Now, next slide, Jack. Next slide after that. This is a picture of Blue John. And if you remember Blue John, you would probably recognize it's a good likeness. Next slide. And this is Bo. Now, let's begin with Blue John. Next slide. Blue John grew up in Martinsville, Virginia. And as a boy, the thing he liked to do was to go out into the countryside and take pictures with a camera that one of his uncles had given him. He would go outside of town along the railroad track. He knew all of the railroad crews very well, and there was a short line railroad running through there, and they would pick him up. And they'd let him ride in the cab out a few miles until he knew where there was an old mill somewhere. He loved those old water-powered mills. And they let him out, and he would go roaming through the woods until he came to it and take a picture. And this is one of those pictures that he took back in the late 1880s. And then toward the end of the afternoon, the train would be coming back toward Martinsville, and they would see him waiting. And they'd pick him up and take him back to town. Blue John, as he grew up, decided that he wanted to go into engineering. And so he decided that he would go to Virginia Polytechnic Institute in Blacksburg to become an engineer. And here is a picture of Virginia Tech. This is one of the leadership buildings. If you're a fan of Virginia Tech, you do know that they've built 2 or 3 buildings over the last century. That's what it looked like a century ago. But Blue John, while he was there, changed his mind. He worked on a part-time basis for an architectural office. And he enjoyed the work, the idea of designing, making something through pencil and paper. And so when he left VPI, he knew that he wanted to be an architect, and he came to Bristol. Coming to Bristol because he liked the railroad connections. They were better than any other place in this area, he thought. And indeed, they were pretty good back then. We had 21 trains per day, passenger trains, passing through Bristol. From here you could go almost anywhere by train, and that was important because the roads were so poor. It would have been impossible in 1907 to have taken an automobile and gone anywhere on the back roads of this area. Soon he brought his bride here, and they lived together in this house which still stands on Mary Street, 308 Mary Street And that's where they started their family. Meanwhile, he worked briefly for another architect, but then he turned to work for himself on his own. And this is the picture of his first house that he designed. It still stands on Lindsay Street, which is about a block or two from Virginia Middle School. Some of you may know it. Now, while he was doing this, the Baptists in Bristol had the need of a new church. And they turned to this young man, because he was at that time a Baptist, and they asked him to design for them a church. Now, if this had been a little bit earlier in time, say in the late 19th century, Blue John would probably have given them a Victorian church with a tall steeple on top, because that would have been what was stylish at that point. But a change had taken place, and that change was the result of a major exposition that occurred in Chicago in the 1890s. In 1893, there was a Columbian exposition to celebrate a couple of things. One was approximately the 400th anniversary of Columbus' discovery of America, and it marked also about 100 years of the Constitution of the United States. The government had been running for about 100 years. And so all of the major architects who were going to design the buildings for the Columbian Exposition gathered in Chicago and had some discussions. And they agreed that all of the buildings should be of the same style. And that style should be the classical style, because it was the classical style that had been in vogue when the Constitution was formed. And they thought that the classical style was more appropriate for a republic. Victorian buildings go with, and Gothic buildings go with monarchy and medievalism. But for a republic, the classical style was the appropriate one. And so as a result, Blue John gave them what they wanted. This is a picture of the Columbian Exposition. Crowds that were gathering there. People who went there saw it and said, "This is such a beautiful place. Oh, if only our cities could have such beautiful buildings like that." And you can see the classical style of those buildings there. Full fair. And so, for Bristol, this is what Blue John gave the Baptists. It looks like a Greek temple, and in many ways it was. Socrates could have been happy there. He felt very much at home. Now, the Greeks emphasized certain things in their architecture. And among them were proportion and ratios. Things had to be just right in their scale. The building had to be just the right width compared to the length. And the height also had to be just exactly right. And Blue John, in designing this building, has done that. The proportions are beautiful there. And it's been set up high on a kind of platform. And those going to church would go up those steps, and they would get a sense that they were going to something inside that was important. And that gave it a sense of dignity. Next slide. Now, here is a picture that is taken from a book on architecture, Greek and Roman architecture, that came out about the time the Baptist church was being built. This is described by the author of the book as one of the most beautiful Greek doorways in existence. Majestic, he called it. It was exactly right in its proportions and in its styling. You can recognize the characteristics of this doorway. It had little rosettes all the way around the frame of the doorway. It had a kind of projection over the doorway that was just exactly right. And in fact, this was the doorway to a building called the Erechtheion, which stood on the Acropolis in Athens, right next to the Parthenon. So here was an example of the best that the Greeks could provide in the way of design. So, What did Blue John do for the Baptist in Bristol? Next slide. This is the building. This is the doorway of the First Baptist Church. Look at it carefully. What do you see? The rosettes running around the frame of the building. The little structure on top of the doorway. Beautiful design. He had copied it. He was giving the Baptist in Bristol the best that he could. And this was a very young man. He had not yet reached his 30th birthday. He knew his architecture, he knew it beautifully, knew his forms and his skill. So with all of that, there was another thing that he did with this building. It was a little bit like Williamsburg. Now, a Greek building would have been all marble. This building is brick. And in colonial Virginia, back in the days when Williamsburg was the capital city, the bricks had been laid in what was called Flemish bond. That was a special way of doing it. Bricks have long headers, they're called, the long side of the brick, and then stretchers, the long side of the brick, and then headers, which are the short side of the brick. And when you're building a building with Flemish bond, you make them alternately. Jack, next slide. And this is an example. This is the wall of the Baptist church. And you can see that the bricks have been laid so that they're headers and stretchers alternately in the whole wall. That was the typical pattern in Williamsburg. Nowadays, most bricks are laid in what's called a common bond, which is just nothing but the stretchers laid out. But Blue John would have it otherwise. It was indeed a beautiful building in just the right proportions. Now, the success of the building at First Baptist soon brought a great many other clients to him. They wanted him to design their buildings for them. And Blue John responded. One of these was for Sullins College. Sullins College had originally been in downtown Bristol, just about where we are standing right now. But in Christmas season, 1915, Sullins College had burned to the ground. And the decision had been made by the authorities that, well, that's too bad. There will be no more Sullins College. We won't rebuild. But there were some Bristol citizens who said, oh no, to the contrary. We must rebuild Sullins. We must keep Sullins College. And they persuaded a man, Dr. William Martin, who had formerly been president of Sullins, but was then down in Alabama, said, come back and help us restore a new Sullins College. And Martin agreed that he would do it. Had to have a location somewhere. They were not going to put it in the same location downtown. And where should that be? And Bristol offered him a bridge on the north side of Bristol. And next slide, Jack. And that's where Sullins was built. This is, I think, one of the grandest locations for a building anywhere in Bristol. This is Park Street that you see before you, and at the very bottom of the picture where there's a stop sign, that's Euclid. And when you leave Euclid and start up Park, as you probably know, if you live here, you go up that gradual hill and you see before you the portico and then the wings of the main building of Sullins College. Unfortunately, over the years, they've let some green trees grow up there. They kind of obstruct the view. And if one of you goes slipping off tonight and saws those trees down, I would be happy. But that was a majestic view, and that was the approach that you made to Sullins College. And it was very, very dramatic, beautifully done. Now, Blue John could have decided to put several buildings on top of the hill. But no, it would be better to have a central portico, classical order of architecture, and then to have one long building that spreads out across the top of that ridge and makes such a beautiful impression. Next slide. And here's another view of it. It is indeed a majestic setting for a college. I taught at King, and I used to kind of envy Sullivan's. They had so much better location for their school than we did. All right. Next slide. Well, Sullivan's was a success. And such a success that Dr. Martin decided that he would start another college in Virginia, of course. And he went up to Arlington, Virginia, just south of the Potomac. And there in the late 20s, he had Blue John design him another college. This is Arlington Hall, which operated as an adjunct to Sullivan's College beginning in the late 20s and into the 30s. And you can see that Blue John in many ways has copied the same form that you saw in Sullivan's College. Now this building actually has had an interesting story. It remained a women's college until Pearl Harbor. Then after Pearl Harbor, the U.S. government was desperately seeking a place where they could start a location where they could recruit people who were good at code breaking, spy activity, listening to Japanese and German coded messages and know how to interpret them and translate them and so forth. And they came to Martin and said, "May we buy your building?" And they did, and this became the center of the American Secret Service operations of that kind during World War II. I understand, though the building is not used for that purpose now, the building is still there, I've been told, but I don't know what is actually done in it now. It is not a college anymore. Sullivan's was not the only college then to benefit from Blue John's expertise. The next one, King College. King College was located at the beginning of World War I, downtown, where we have had Massengill pharmaceutical firm and several other names of companies that have gone in there. But that was a very small campus. And the authorities at King had been anxious for years and years to find some better location out in town where they could have a larger area. In 1916, Isaac Anderson, the son of the founder of Bristol, offered land that he had east of Bristol, 66 acres, and the college joyfully accepted it. Said, "We can move King College out to this new location." And they turned to Blue John and said, "Draw us some plans." And he produced an entire campus. There's everything you need, all of the buildings, a chapel, an administration building, a library, athletic facilities, all of that. Well, the authorities didn't have quite that much money at that time. In fact, it was going to be a struggle to find enough funds to erect the first building. But they did. They put on a campaign in Bristol to get the necessary funds, and the result was this building, Bristol Hall, which many of you will know, called Bristol Hall because the citizens of Bristol had given so generously for its construction. We will name it for the people in this city. And Bristol Hall was built in 1917. It was to be followed by other buildings. This is the dining hall that was built shortly afterward. There's an interesting story about this building. I came to King in 1952 when this was the dining hall. It's an interesting building. It's a two-story building. First floor was the area where you had the actual dining room, a large, spacious room. You can see from the rounded windows over on the left side just how it was a high ceiling in that floor, and it was very appropriate. And there were no pillars, no columns to support the upper story, but it's a two-story building. And up on the second floor, you have rooms, and you have people with heavy furniture, and folks are moving about. And I often wondered, how does that ceiling hold all of that? Why doesn't it crash down? And was it really safe? And for years I kind of wondered, but I knew there was no steel in this building. It was all wood and brick. That was about it. Well, many years later, when Bo was working at King on the project, I mentioned my concern to him. And I said, how can it be that that holds up? And he said, well, let's go see. So we went over to the building, went in, went up to the second floor, and then we went up into the attic. He found a trapdoor. And when he got there, he said, there's your solution. And I was amazed because up in the attic of the building, there were massive, big wooden beams shaped in truss forms. If you've ever gone on a bridge, railroad bridge or a highway bridge, and seen the trusses that are over the bridge surface, that are in triangular shapes, is that truss that holds the bridge up. Well, this truss up in the attic was holding up the building. Long iron rods came from the truss down through the second floor to the ceiling of the first floor, and there they were bolted up so that the whole second floor was held up by the trusses in the attic. And when Bo came down out of the trapdoor from the attic, he said, that's an ingenious solution, but it works. And it has. That building is almost 100 years old. And then there was another building built at about the same time. Many of you will know this. This was the old president's home. And there was still another school that had the benefit of this. Next slide. This is Virginia Intermont. Virginia Intermont had already come to Bristol from Glade Spring, where it was founded. And the first buildings had already been built there. And Blue John designed this building to be a dormitory. It's called East Hall. He built a West Hall on the other side of the main building to complement this. And you can see that the style of these buildings quite different from what he did at Sullivan's or at King. And Blue John had the capability of making the design, the style, suit the situation, because the original plan for Virginia Intermont had been quite different from the other colleges. Well, Blue John was getting to be quite known by this time, and he began to get a whole series of commissions to design buildings. And you will recognize this one. This was built as Virginia High School about 1920. There was criticism of this building. You wouldn't see it from this, but you know what the criticism was? Why did the authorities build that building so far out from town? That was 1920. Why didn't they build it downtown, as it should have been? Blue John insisted, and indeed it was well placed, no question at all. Next slide. And then in the early 20s, Blue John designed this building, the Reynolds Arcade Building. Bristol had had several office buildings by this time. Most of them were 2- and 3-story old wooden and brick buildings that served for office purposes. But this was Bristol's first modern steel and concrete office building. And when it was put up, immediately a lot of people rushed to have their offices put there. 7-story building. The Southern Railway, which had offices in Bristol, took over the entire 5th floor. Blue John himself, he put his offices in the 6th floor. I'm sure he liked to do that because he could look out there and see all of the buildings about over Bristol, many of which he was designing at that time. In fact, I think architects did that sort of thing. I know of an architect in Chicago who built a rather tall building. Then on top of the tall building, he placed a little tower. That's where his offices were, in the tower. And you can see everything all over downtown Chicago. All right. Some of you will recognize this next building. That's the old Kings Mountain Hospital, also built in the early 1920s. Until it was designed by Blue John, Bristolians who had to go to the hospital went to an old private home that had been appropriated for that purpose. Well, that was very unsatisfactory, and already an organization had been formed called the Kings Mountain Association to collect money ultimately someday build a hospital. And they had done so by the early 1920s. And this was the King's Mountain Hospital. Served that way until the early 50s when Bristol's got still another hospital. Some of you will remember this one as a building that stood vacant and derelict for many, many years before it was taken down. And then another building. This is the Bank of Bristol, also built in the early 1920s. It didn't make it through the Depression, and it folded. So let me ask you a question. What happened to that building?
Sterling House.
Have you ever seen this building?
Yes.
Is it still there?
Yes.
Kind of Sterling House.
It's on, it was originally built on State Street. Do you recognize it?
It's where Sharing Christ is.
Well, the answer is yes and no. The building is still there, but the front has been changed. So if Jack will show the next slide, we'll see if you recognize it. Now, another building that came off of Billy John's drawing board at this time was this one that we show. This is the E.W. King Warehouse building. Mr. E.W. King had become a very successful merchant in Bristol. He dealt in wholesale goods and had really a very fine business. But he needed a space where he could use as a warehouse to keep all of the goods that he was bringing in and selling. And this building, which still stands on Shelby Street, was built in the late 1920s. And then one more building that is no longer with us now. Do you recognize this one? That's the General Shelby Hotel, built in the late 1920s, and was the newest, I suppose the finest, hotel in Bristol through the 30s and the 40s and the 50s. And this is a picture taken just before it opened. And you can't see it from where you are, but there's a big sign on the front of the building which says that they would be happy to have people who wish to come and spend the night there, or if people would like to stay on a long-term basis, say by the month, they would take them also. Bill John designed not only these kinds of buildings, but other things as well. Next slide. Any of you recognize this?
Yes.
This was originally called the High Rock Knitting Mill. And this was the central section of that building, and it had wings that spread out on either side at a great distance. It was a knitting mill. It stood on what was then known as Pierce Street, but today we call Pierce Street. What do we call it? Good. Okay. This building remained until just a few months ago. In the early part of 2014, it was finally taken down. Now, you might think from all of this that I've shown you that he didn't design any houses, any buildings in which people might live, apartments or houses. Not true at all. Next slide. Many of you recognize this. This was a set of apartment buildings designed by him in the early 1920s called the Staley Apartments. They stood in the area of Bristol that was changed so much through urban renewal in the next, this is in the 60s. And it was next to what is now known as Anderson Park.
Sound system is acting up.
Getting echo?
It's an
Can
echo.
I stand it with? Is this better? I'll talk softly. I'm accustomed to yelling in class.
Yes, that's better. That's better.
That's better? Okay. We'll try to do that. Good, thank you so much. Okay, these were the state apartments on Franklin Street. Franklin Street doesn't exist anymore, but as I say, it was close to where Anderson Park is, near Martin Luther King. Okay, here's another apartment building. Now, I'll bet you'll recognize this one. This also was built in the 20s. What about homes? Well, Blue John had the ability to give his clients whatever kind of design they wanted. And so we shall see that he designed a variety of styles. Next one. This is a house on Holston Avenue, and it's in the shingle style, which was very popular at that time. The walls were shingled. And this was built for the Ensign King family. The house still stands and is in excellent condition. I see I'm getting, I think I'm getting an echo from something.
You might turn the volume down just a little bit if we can adjust. See what that does.
Is that better? I may have to shout louder, but I can do that. All right, good. We'll try that. Okay. But a lot of homeowners wanted the Southern colonial style. He said, Blue John, give me a house with big columns out front. That's what I want. And he could do that. So, next slide. Here's a house on Euclid. Southern colonial. Looks pretty good, doesn't it? Another slide. Here's another Southern colonial. This is on Holston. Very well done. Sturdy. Next slide. Ah, there's another one. You know, this looks like this belongs in Gone with the Wind. Next slide. Now here's a small example of a much smaller house. But yet, very distinctive colonial, and actually it's much larger than you would think. And now I wonder, in looking at these 4 pictures, did you notice anything unusual? Somewhat different? I have looked through these pictures time again and again and again, going through this and rehearsing, and it was only a few days ago that I noticed something about those houses. Jack, back up 3 slides.
Symmetry.
One more. Oh, no, go back.
The gable on the front.
Hip roof.
Okay, I'll tell you. He has doubled the front columns. And in so doing, he has made the building seem to be sturdier. And he can have smaller columns. Next slide. Now, notice that one? This one? The columns are doubled. Next one? That one? Even the small one, which is the next. The columns are doubled. And it set me wondering, and I'm going to ask the Kearfott family someday, is that a trait that he did? Or did it just happen those were the ones that I was showing? All right, but there were those who did not want that kind of style. They wanted something else. And so he could provide that too. Here is a kind of stone and tudor style on Euclid Avenue. And one of the styles that was very popular in the 20s, Blue John was an expert at that as well, was this, the Mediterranean, or some would call it the Spanish style. This was the house that he designed for Dr. Martin, who was president of Sullins College. It still stands just across the street on Glenway from Sullins. And then there were others like that. Next one. This is the Jim Cecil house that he designed that was on you, again, in the Mediterranean style. And then this one. That's in the Mediterranean style. But is anything particularly interesting about this house? This was Blue John's own house. This is where he lived. And the thing that people who remember the house most tell you about its characteristics. Down in the basement, he had the greatest model railway system you had ever seen. He loved trains. And so he had model railways, and guess what was out in the side yard? An old miniature working mill. That's characteristic of what he did. Okay, and then still other styles. This is an unusual one. There was a Bristol attorney named Alonzo Jason Tyler, who, about the time of World War I, wanted a house like that. He had seen one in Colorado, and he wanted this one to kind of resemble that. It is log on the first floor, it is shingle up on the second floor. It was built in what was then way out in the country away from Bristol. It is on Tyler Drive, which is where Bluff City Highway and the Volunteer Parkway come together in the Avoca section of town. Now, you can go and see it there. Okay. Next slide. Blue John had an associate during this period, Mr. Arnold. Mr. Arnold helped him, but on occasion, Arnold would design his own buildings. And whenever that was the case, Blue John was always very happy to give him full credit for it. And this is one of Mr. Arnold's designs. A house done in the 1920s. We've got a picture of what it looked like when it was just built, and the oak tree was about 3 feet tall. Now, what we have seen so far, this is by the late 20s. Blue John has designed a lot of houses and buildings of all kinds. Banks, office buildings, hotels, schools, colleges, factories, retail stores, apartments, residences. A very versatile man with a big practice at this time. And then, in the late 1920s, next slide, came the Great Depression. And virtually everything stopped then. Now, if you're running a grocery store, people have got to eat. And they may not eat as much, but they'll come back to the grocery store. But if you are an architect who designs new factories and business buildings and residences, your business falls off dramatically. People simply do not have the funds. And Blue John experienced that. It was tough times for him during the Depression. He tried to find other things he could do to complement his work. Finally, he had to close his office in the Reynolds Arcade, and he just looked for other things. In 1933, he was employed in the development of the Hungry Mother State Park in Smith County, which was just being formed at that time. And he went up there and stayed for months while he laid out the grounds, helped superintend the construction of the buildings. And it is at that time that also something else happened. Next slide. This is how he done Blue John. 1933, Eleanor Roosevelt visited White Top Mountain, and local scouts were used as guides for the many visitors that were coming to see the First Lady. And Blue John was a scoutmaster. He became concerned about his boys. He didn't want them to get out of hand, not while the First Lady is here. No telling what they might do. And so he rode hard on their behavior. And one scout remarked about Mr. Kearfott, "He's just like Blue John. He takes the cream out of everything." Now, I don't know whether that means anything to you or not. But back in those days, you did not get homogenized milk. When the dairy truck came by in the morning and left a bottle of milk on your doorstep, it would be, the cream would be at the top and the regular milk would be at the bottom, because frequently cooks like to pour off the cream and use it for special cooking purposes. And if you did that, the milk that was left at the bottom had, believe it or not, and I can testify to the case, it had a kind of bluish color to it. And it came to be known as Blue John. We never called it that in my family, but that's what it came to be, Blue John. And so, running on these people, what was he doing? Taking the cream, the fun out of everything. He was just like Blue John. Mr. Kearfott laughed at the remark. The scouts started calling him Blue John. And soon that title spread among all his friends in the community. He accepted it, he liked it, and that's how he was known for the rest of his life. Slowly, conditions began to improve, very slowly, and by 1936, Blue John was ready to reopen his office, not in the Reynolds Arcade building, but he went to a smaller place and began designing houses once again. And this house is on at the junction of Euclid and Long Crescent. Is where is the first house that he designed after he resumed his practice. And then in 1940, he designed the Piedmont building, which stands on Piedmont Street downtown. And he moved his office there and stayed there. And things began to improve. But then came World War II in the 40s. And the business fell off again, because this was not a time when people were encouraged to build new buildings and new houses. Materials were hard to get. Things were in short supply. There were restrictions upon you. And Blue John did not do a great deal during that period. And when the war was over and he was ready to resume it, he began to experience the one thing that would really cripple an architect's abilities. He began to experience difficulties in eyesight. He came down with macular degeneration, and steadily his eyesight went downhill, and he found he had to give up the practice that he had had. He called upon his son, Bo, to come and keep the firm going, and Bo came at that time. Now, Blue John, however, took his retirement in great fun and profitably. There are many things that he did during this period. He remembered his mills that he had enjoyed seeing so much. And so he took to going out in the countryside around here, throughout Virginia, different places, where there was an old mill. And he would get some friends to go with him and say, I know where there's an old mill up in Russell County. It's falling down, but we ought to go up there and take a picture of it before it's gone entirely. And they would go and take it. Joe Van Pelt was one of his best friends on such excursions like that. And he began putting them together, and he decided he would do a book. And he brought out a book called Highland Mills, which is a wonderful book because it's got the flavor of Blue John's manner of expression, and it's also filled with all kinds of data about old mills. He was actually saving them for posterity and putting them into this book. It's a great book. If you ever get a chance to see it, read it, you will enjoy it. Highland Mills. And then he began to write a series of stories about things that he remembered from his early days in Bristol. And he started printing them in the newspaper. And he did quite a large number. And in the 1990s, the Bristol Historical Association decided they wanted to do a reprint of those stories. So they collected them, found out there were 52 of them, like one every week for a whole year. They brought them together, and the result was the publication of this book, Blue John Remembers. And they are delightful stories about things that he saw and experienced in Bristol in his early days. I can't resist telling you a Blue John story at this point, so I'll tell you one of his stories, give you something of the flavor. There was a man early one morning, very early in the morning, who was walking across a railroad trestle that stood about where Shelby Street meets the Volunteer Parkway. There used to be a railroad track that ran down Beaver Creek, paralleling Beaver Creek, where the Volunteer Parkway is today. And it was on that track where there was a trestle that this man was walking. He started to light a cigarette. He pulled the cigarette out, struck his match to it, and was getting ready to, well, see, I've got to tell you something else about that story I haven't mentioned. At that time, Piedmont Street had just been covered over. Did you know that Beaver Creek, which flows into Bristol from the north side, goes underground and emerges again on the Tennessee side? This took place in the 1920s when they paved over Piedmont Street, which is actually on top of Beaver Creek, all the way from about 3 blocks north of State Street until it goes under the Tennessee line and under some of the buildings and comes out and then heads on down the Volunteer Parkway. Well, that had just recently been built at this time. And I need to tell you also that up on the north end of Bristol, there was a very large tank of gasoline. And it was leaking badly. And you know that as gasoline mixes with water, gasoline being lighter, flows on top of the water. So to pick up the story, this man had lighted his cigarette and he takes the match and just lets it toss down into the creek bed. Woo! You can imagine what happened. It was not what he had expected. It was said that the last time he was seen, he seemed to be heading for the next county. Well, the flames flared up there. Not only did they flare up there, but they spread out immediately up and down the creek. They went up the creek, up into the area that was covered over by Piedmont Street, and some of the people who were coming into town early that morning thought it rather unusual when they began to see black smoke pouring out of the gutters alongside the street, and then flames were shooting forth. What does this mean? And in some cases it actually lifted the manhole covers. And the fire worked its way up north, up through downtown Bristol, over to the north side where the tank was. And bam! The tank exploded. That was it, and it was all over. Except on the south side, it was still flowing faster than the creek, and the flames rushed southward through the Tennessee section. Well, there was a farmer who lived on the banks of Beaver Creek down at the south end of Bristol, and he'd gotten up early that morning. His wife was in the kitchen. She was fixing breakfast, and he would go out and milk the cow. So he was out there milking the cow when all of a sudden he heard a funny noise, like he had never heard before, kind of roaring, rushing noise. And he looked up, and there he saw Beaver Creek, a fire, flames shooting up. And it was not only up there, it was coming right toward him. He rushed into the house, saying to his wife, "No use fixing breakfast, Ma. The end of the world is coming." Oh, that's a good story. Okay. Another thing that he did during this period was to produce this little map that you see over there. It's a historical and geographic map. It is a beautiful thing. He drew that himself, had copies made, and you may see copies around in town. It is a splendid little map. Don't forget to look at it. All right. Now, as to Bo. Bo took over the work beginning in the period right after World War II. Bo had graduated from Carnegie Institute of Technology, and World War II was just getting started at that time, but he got a job designing Oak Ridge. Oak Ridge was being built at that point to be the super secret American city for atomic research. And they needed quickly to design the whole city, streets, buildings, everything. Well, with training as an architect, he was the right person for that job, and he worked there for many months until it had been completed, and Oak Ridge was opened for settlement, though still secret. And then he went and joined the Merchant Marine and worked on the U.S. Fort Ridgely as a radio operator for the rest of the war. Then he came back to Bristol and took up the practice and increasingly took over the practice that Blue John had. Beau was different in what he approached. Beau was not as much interested in houses. He did houses, but that was not his main interest. Beau's interest was more in terms of larger scale, big projects, factories, municipal buildings, schools, hospitals, things of that sort. And where Blue John had liked to design buildings in many different styles, as he did, Beau liked the modern style, buildings that emphasize the use of steel and glass and concrete. And you'll see that in some of the buildings that we look at. If someone wanted a building in the older style, he could get it. But his preference was the other kind. And he was involved in many, many projects in Bristol. Next slide. Next slide for that. Here is Stamp Hall. This is an example of just one of many buildings and complexes that Bristol, Virginia built beginning in 1940. Rice Terrace, Johnson Court, and many of these housing projects. The Kearfott firm, first Blue John and then Beau, were heavily involved in that kind of work. And they did almost all of that work for the city of Bristol, Virginia. And I'm just showing Jones Manor as an example of that sort of thing. Okay, thanks. And here is Bristol Memorial Hospital. Neither of the Kearfotts designed that building, built in the early 1950s, but once it had been completed, almost immediately there was a growing need for additions, for specialties, services, labs and things that the original building did not have, and Beau became involved in that. And over a period of about 25 years, he was almost constantly involved in renovations, additions, and changes to that hospital. He did more than 10 projects costing millions and billions of dollars until the 1970s. And then, in fact, I talked to one of the doctors who said he was a familiar figure at the Bristol Memorial Hospital in those days. All the time, you'd find him around doing something, some new project. He was also involved with schools, Bristol, Virginia. This one is the Washington and Lee Elementary School, built in 1968. And then this next one is the Van Pelt School, 1970s. Represents the changing expectations and demands. Note that this building is entirely on one floor. No steps necessary. Important. And then there were other things that he did. There were numerous additions that he made to the Bristol, Virginia Senior High School, which was turned into a middle school. And then he began making additions to the Bristol, Virginia High School. Next slide. This is the auditorium of Bristol, Virginia High. Next slide. This is the gymnasium. Both of these big buildings are placed right next to each other. It created something of a problem for the architect. Gymnasiums and auditoriums are by their nature big, bulky buildings. And unfortunately, the space that had originally been allotted for the Virginia High School had been pretty well taken up. By the time they were ready to build these buildings, there was no place left except virtually on the sidewalk. And these buildings were built there about the best that you could do, but not much of a landscaping effect there. And then next slide. He was involved in this building, which you've seen on Cumberland Street, for the government of Bristol, Virginia. And another slide, another building that he designed at this time was the Bristol Library. Up until the 1960s, the Bristol Public Library had been housed over on the Tennessee side in an old Victorian mansion. Some of you may have checked out what's there. We needed a new library. We needed a really modern library. And in 1963, the Bristol, Virginia Public Library was built on this location. And it stood here until it was too small and needed changing. And so what happened was that the books were moved out. You remember they went to a grocery store over on Euclid, and we all went over there for a year or so and checked our books out while they were building this new building. What happened to the old public library? Did we tear it down?
No.
Did we put it on rollers and move it away? Where did it go?
Nowhere.
Well, the truth is, it's still there. Next slide. This is the old library built in 1963, and this is the office part of the present library. You probably don't go in there very often, but it's still there, and very nice as well. And then he did work on a number of the colleges here. Next slide, Jack. This is the Baskerville Library from Sullins College, built in the late 1960s. Next slide. This is the administration classroom building built for Sullins. And the next slide. But perhaps this was the most interesting building of all. This was the Performing Arts Center, built about 1970 at Sullins College. There's a very interesting story about this building. It was a beautifully done building, excellent for performances. You'll see, next slide, Jack. You'll see from this slide that it had a high platform for the performers. The audience was arranged in a kind of semicircle around the building, elevated seats, and then behind those there were 3 openings. You can see only one here over at the far end. When you had large audiences, you would open those spaces up. If you had a small audience, you would close them up. And it was used for a great many performances. Perhaps one of the most remarkable performances that took place in this building came when Dr. Martin, the president, contracted to bring to Sullins a New York City ballet group. They came down one day and they went into the auditorium to begin practicing their routines for that evening performance. One of the Sullins staff saw them and rushed over to tell Dr. Martin that the ballet people have come and you really ought to go see them. And he said, that's fine and good, but I'm in a meeting right now with my trustees. I'll go when it's over. And I said, you really ought to go see them right now. There was an urgency the way that was expressed, and so Dr. Martin said, well, all right, and he excused himself from the trustee meeting, and I will go see him. And he went over to there, looked in, and saw that indeed the ballet group was rehearsing, but it was not what you would call a dress rehearsal. They can start, eh? And he asked, what happened? Did your costumes get lost on the way coming down or something? Oh no, this is the way we always perform in the morning. Well, you can't do that here. Go get some costumes or something. Put them on. Well, we don't have any costumes. You see, we just put on our street clothes to get here, and that's all we have. Well, perform in your street clothes. They didn't want to do that, no? And so there was quite a discussion. And finally a compromise. Probably not exactly one that was satisfactory to all parties, but this is what happened. That evening, when the audience came to see the ballet, one of the actors came forward. They all had street clothes on. Said, we don't normally perform this way, but we understand the situation, and so our official performance is going to be the one we're giving right now, in our street clothes. Now, when we have concluded that performance, we will retire backstage, and we will come out as we do in New York, and we will give a second performance, New York style. And if anyone wants to stay, you're welcome to do it, or if you want to go home, go home. And so that's what was done. Now you have a question. Really good. The fact of the matter is that There were some who stayed for the second performance. Not a majority, but there were some who did. Okay. Well, so much for that one. He also designed buildings for Jimmy Intermont. Next slide, Jack. This is the Student Center at VI. Next slide, Jack. This is the Science Building at VI. Next slide. And here is where he actually designed a modern style dormitory for Virginia Intermont. That's what he preferred. Next slide. And this is the Harrison Jones Auditorium. You've probably been there for performances. And he designed buildings for King College as well. Next slide. This is the Science Building at King College. And this building posed a bit of a problem. It was to have instruction and laboratories in biology, chemistry, and in physics. The physics department was given the basement of the building. Dr. Burke, head of the physics department, wanted the students to be able to do research using light. That's all right, you turn on the lights. No. He wanted them to be able to use solar light, sunlight, because it's different in its characteristics from this kind of electric light. Well, you're in the basement. But can you do that? How can you get sunlight down in the basement of a building when you have no windows down there? Well, they worked out an ingenious system. On top of the building, at the rear, there was a large chamber, kind of like a tunnel, passageway, with a mirror on top. The mirror could be adjusted. It caught the rays of the sun, reflected them down this passageway, down through the building, all the way into the basement. And there in the basement, there were additional mirrors that could be used then to deflect the sunlight into a laboratory for experimentation, into a classroom for a demonstration, whatever, and it worked pretty well. Another ingenious solution thing. Then one more building at King. This was the building you've probably seen, the present dining hall, built there. Next slide. This, you know, as today, the Exide Manufacturing Company. Originally, this was the office building for the Univac Spare Land Corporation in Bristol. Next slide. And this building downtown, Tri-Summit Bank, was originally built for the Washington Trust. I like that building. I think its lines are clean, clear-cut, designed. To me, it's a beautiful building. And it's got a lower floor that's sort of one style, and then there's vertical sections up above. I think that's an excellent design for the building. All right, next slide. Well, Blue-John and Bo designed a lot of buildings on this. This was the job book in which they kept the record of all of those designs that they made. And we estimate about 2,000 in all. And this is the ones where, in many cases, we can't determine exactly where the building was, the location, or who was responsible for designing it, building it. And we would like for you to come up here if you live in one of the Kearfott house and write your name there and give us that information. Now, this raises the question, how do we remember the Kearfatts, both of them, all that they did for Bristol? Write the big monuments for them or something? Well, I want to suggest to you a way we should recognize them. And I want to take something from history. I want to go way back to the 17th century, shortly after the time of Shakespeare in London. London in the 1660s had a major and disastrous fire. The whole center of the city was wiped out completely. But almost immediately, people came forward, determined they were going to rebuild, and they started the reconstruction of their city. The king, Charles II, turned to one man and made him the master of construction for the government buildings that would have to be built. There were the churches that had been destroyed in the center of London. Build new churches, 52 of them had to be built. And this was Christopher Wren. He was not trained to be an architect, but he had a particular kind of genius for design. Ability was incredible. And Christopher Wren took this on, and he designed and started the construction of these 52 churches. And the thing that was remarkable is that they were all different. You would think he might have drawn 3 or 4 generic patterns, you know, and make those 8 of those buildings over there that design, and make some of this design, but they were all different. He had enough talent to be able to do them separately. But the major thing that he did was the reconstruction of the cathedral downtown, and that was St. Paul's. And he decided that he would not build a medieval Gothic building, but the design would be in the newer classical style that was prevalent at that time. And so he turned to design one. Something like maybe St. Peter's in Rome, which had that great dome. Wren had never seen a dome on a building. But he figured he could figure out how to do it. And he did. And he built St. Paul, worked on it for the rest of his life, hard on it, doing all of the engineering of the thing. In fact, he built 3 domes, one after another, to create the dome that we know so well. And he died just as the building was being completed. They buried him, appropriately enough, in the crypt of St. Paul's. And there they placed on his monument an inscription, which they felt was the only appropriate thing to say. And it was, of course, in Latin. And it said, Si monumentum requiris circumspice, which translated into English said, if you seek his monument, look around you. And I think that is the one way in which we can observe and celebrate what the Kearfotts did for Bristol. Next slide, Jeff. If we ask the question, what did the Kearfotts do for Bristol? All we have to respond with is, look around you. See all of these buildings that remain, talents of this people. And that concludes my program. Thank you. Sometimes it is customary for the person who presented the program to then ask the audience about any questions. I'm not going to do that. I wouldn't dare do that. Because what some of you may not know is that we have Kearfott family members here. And they know so much more than I do about some of these things. Margaret Kearfott is wife of Poe. Point out some of your relatives here. You've got 1 or 2 here, I understand.
They're all taking up the first and second rows here, and they're all from all over the country. And I want you to know that Susan Anderson is Bo's sister. And we're so Gladys Resnick stand. She has been Blue John and Bo's secretary for years. Asking all of Bo's relatives and Blue John's relatives, I can't introduce all of them. There's so many. They're from all over the United States, and they came for your program. Dr. Wade, thank you.
So, you see,
all the relatives stand.
yeah, let me. say, if you have questions, look around you and find one of the perfect relatives and ask them. They will know far more than I do. I'll be happy to answer any I can. But come and take a look at the displays here, and if there's any food left, you're welcome to it. Thank you so much.
Blacksburg Bakery, thank you.